6 months ago, I read a book called Deep Thinking by a Canadian mathematician, William Byers. And he's got 3 books which I would recommend any of them, particularly on this topic, the second and the third, Blind Spot and Deep Thinking. Many of the issues that are the topic of this course are things he has discussed, not from the social and psychological point of view as much as from the point of view of a mathematician, because he says the same things essentially. We think of mathematics as the pure logic, pure certainty, pure rationality, and his argument is that at the base of mathematics is pure ambiguity. We think of it as the most logical of all subjects, and yet inherently that is also a social construction, because the fundamental concepts of mathematics are equally ambiguous, but we brush over it. As a fact, all three are very fascinating books, and they don't require a lot of mathematical. He kind of tones it down. And I was wondering where all of this came from, and when I got to the third book, I even asked him, I said, there seems to be something more that you're not telling us that came out in the webinar. On the webinar, he said, well, I won't go there. Let me not go there. So I asked him afterwards, where is it that you aren't going to go? And he wouldn't tell me. And then when I read the third book, I found out that he has 2 loves in life. One of them is mathematics, and the second is Zen Buddhism. And it was the Zen Buddhism that helped him to see the limitations of the conceptual framework of mathematics. It was really fascinating, and I heartily recommend them. They're quite readable. Okay, so this is a summary of what we discussed on conceptual systems, which we're calling CS. Mine is looking to is seeking the security of certainty. We have an inbuilt urge for it, and essentially you can say it's an irrational urge. I don't mean that it's undesirable. I mean it's not driven by logic. We're trying to get certainty in a world that's filled with uncertainty. We have a drive for certainty, and that drive for certainty is subconsciously influencing what we look for and what type of knowledge we seek, and how we avoid areas of ambiguity and try to override them and convince ourselves that we really have something that's certain, because we want that certainty. In other words, the certainty is the emotional drive, and we never think of how much it guides what we accept as knowledge. And Byers was arguing, even as a mathematician, he became a mathematician because he was seeking certainty. And ultimately discovered that the fundamentals of mathematics were uncertain and ambiguous. So it gives us an insight into a basic drive underlying our quest for knowledge. He says that this is his definition: a conceptual system is an integrated family of concepts that create a unified universe of meaning and experience. And I think I gave some examples of conceptual systems. Mathematics is a conceptual system. Euclidean geometry is a conceptual system. We think of it, this is the truth. For 1,600 years after Euclid, we thought there was only one type of geometry, which was Euclidean, until the principles of non-Euclidean geometry were developed. We thought this was reality. But now we realize it's only one way of looking at reality and a limited sphere. The Big Bang is a conceptual system. The black hole is a conceptual system. Biological evolution, health, cancer, democracy, human rights, market economy, science. That was a nice point that came out now. I forget who just made it in the last session, but science itself, and Alberto was talking about the way we understand science. It's a conceptual system, and when you start to mark out all of the premises, all of the implicit values that are behind it, you really see it in a different context. And for any of you who are interested, I would recommend a book by Lee Smolin, who's a physicist. He was at Harvard, now he's in Canada. He wrote a book about 6-7 years ago called The Trouble with Physics. It's a fascinating book. He's a particle physicist and a theoretical physicist, and essentially he starts talking about physics as a social construction and how it functions as the sociology of science. It's really fascinating. And I think it's important that if we learn knowledge in this context, if we learn it in its wider conceptual framework, we'll be much more able to use its strengths and not be lost or limited by its limitations as we are now. So, education I already referred to. Marriage is a conceptual system. Personality, because is like that. So virtually all of the important things, we have a construction of reality which we take for being the reality itself. The characteristics of a conceptual system is that they're rule-based, logical, and systematic, and therefore we think they're true. But the premise here is that they are rule-based, logical, and systematic within a set of premises. They are within a defined territory. They are based on certain assumptions, which are very often implicit, and within those assumptions, they're rule-based, systematic, and logical. But if you don't know the assumptions, or if you don't take it into account, you think that, well, this must be the way things are, because you don't see the limits. They're self-imposed limits in defining the system. As I gave the example earlier today, Newton was not aware that he was working within a conceptual system by assuming that space and time are absolutes. He thought he was just talking about reality, and everybody did, until Einstein made us understand this is only a limited part of a greater reality. So he was aware of what was outside. All conceptual systems are incomplete. They contain questions that they're unable to answer within the system. This is a very interesting point. I think many of you may be familiar with the challenges today in physics of unifying relativity theory and quantum theory. They fundamentally have two different views of the world that are not compatible with each other. The theory of gravity in quantum mechanics is that gravity is a force. The theory of gravity in relativity theory is that gravity comes because space is curved around mass. It's a completely different conception. Both of them mathematically are predictive, but they have completely different conception of reality. And that's an obvious case. In his books, Byers shows that even numbers are conceptual systems. We take it for reality. When we think of numbers, when we learn them first as counting numbers. How many apples, oranges, horses, cats, and so forth like that. He argues that for the Greeks, the primary interest in numbers was for measurement, not for counting. They were geometric. They looked at numbers as showing a distance. Distance is a little different than counting. It's not like you're counting all the things in the way. You want a length. A length is different from a count. It's a different conceptual system. That becomes obvious when you learn fractions as a child. Because suddenly you thought you knew what numbers were, you add them and subtract them and things like that, and suddenly somebody tells you that 1/2, 1/4, and 1/10 are also numbers. It's a different concept. How can something smaller than 1 or a part of something else be a number in itself? And the point that Byers makes from this is, as children, we have all learned conceptual systems. And we have all learned to move from one conceptual system to another. We have learned first that numbers are for counting, and then numbers are for distance or for weight, and then you have fractional numbers, and then you can have decimal numbers, and then you can subtract 5 from 10 and you have 5, but what happens when you subtract 10 from 5? You get minus 5. How can you have a minus number? If numbers are a count, how can you have less than 0? So the imaginary numbers, the negative numbers, are different conceptual systems, each which has its own behavior. So we already learn how to move from one conceptual system to another. We've done it throughout our life. The only thing is, we've not been taught that we're moving. We've not learned that we're moving. We've not learned that our earlier conception was limited, and now we're widening it and taking on a wider conception. And therefore, throughout our lives, once we arrive at a conception, we think we've arrived at certainty, and we cling to the security of the certainty of this is the system, and everything must be consistent with it. And that's what makes his thought very interesting. We experience reality through the window of conceptual systems. That, I think, came out in our discussions in the last session. And we'll hear tomorrow from Chandrasekharan talking about health. It's a conceptual system. Alberto was talking about it. What is mental health? What is the role of a doctor? What is law? Winston will talk to that when we hear him next. Each of them is a conceptual system of reality for which we take for a reality in itself without recognizing the underlying assumptions or premises until you meet somebody who comes with a different view. And our training, our habit is, when we meet with somebody who's speaking from a different conceptual system, we first think they're unintelligent. We secondly think that they're troublesome. We third think we just don't understand what's wrong with these people, that they can't understand the reality. Because we don't understand that we're looking from within a system. We're not conscious of the boundaries and assumptions through which we look. And they're not conscious very often of the boundaries through which they look, and there's no communication. And this is the basis for intercultural conflicts and interdisciplinary and conflicts as well. If you've ever listened to the neoliberals and the Keynesians arguing on any point in economics, you would see that they can argue back and forth for hours or days on these issues, and they're simply talking from a different set of assumptions, and one trying to say we're right and the other's wrong, rather than looking at the whole, the wider whole, and let's be clear about what our assumptions are and where we're coming from. Any conceptual system is founded on conscious and subconscious values, premises, and perspectives. And I think that point has been well made this morning, and Alberto stressed it in a number of points. Certainly, those who were using the calendar up to Copernicus were never conscious of the fact that the calendar is a conceptual system, and it was founded on the assumption that the Earth is the center of the universe. Nobody was reflecting on that. I mentioned Newton and Democracy, a beautiful book written on Future of Freedom by Fareed Zakaria about 5 years ago, which he gave the argument which I mentioned before the break, that the real origins of modern democracy is a culture of liberalism. It's not a set of institutions. The institutions came later. The real heart of democracy was a set of values. And those are so subconscious that when we want to go and spread democracy to other countries, we go and spread the institutions, not realizing the implicit assumptions that if you have these, we assume that if you have these institutions, you're going to behave the way we behave, whereas actually they behave in very different ways because the underlying values are different. So it's really important. When we take our system for reality when we're not conscious of the underlying premises, we tend to take it for reality, and that generates a lot of confusion and often mistakes. I gave a few examples earlier today about market economy. I think I mentioned the Swedish economist, who Adam Smith used the phrase invisible hand. If he saw how the phrase was being used today, he would go back to the grave. The irony is that Smith wanted to remove the collusion between the government and the mercantile interests who were trying to raise tariffs on imports so that they could sell more at home without competition. And he wanted economy to benefit the people, not to benefit the merchants. And he saw that government was being used to actually benefit the corporations to the detriment of human welfare. He was a moral philosopher. He wasn't an economist. And now the argument is being used exactly in the opposite way and quoted against him. So all our concepts, all that we pass for knowledge is based on some type of conceptual framework. In economics, one of the common principles of neoliberalism is rational choice, that human beings, if they're given rational choice, will make the right decisions. Only problem comes in times like 1929 or 2008, and then the economist says, well, that's irrational exuberance. Except when there's irrational exuberance, we're based on rational choice. So there's an assumption of rational choice when I think we all know, when we see how we make our decisions, rationality has, and when we listen to Mario especially, we know that rationality has very little to do with a lot of the decisions that we make. And this is a very interesting point which we'll come back to tomorrow under the topic of objectivity and subjectivity. He says all conceptual systems are self-referential. There is no such thing as knowledge divorced from the person who's knowing, divorced from the assumptions and perspective and values and beliefs of the person who's trying to know. There is always the subjective role in it. And I think several people alluded to this morning. There's the linguistic contribution, the social contribution, the social construction, the concepts with which we come to any subject and which we take for granted. And to not be aware, to think that we are talking about reality objectively without being aware of the subjective part that we bring to it. I had this experience very graphically when I first came to India, and I started talking to social scientists there about society. And I realized that the conception of society I had as an American, same word, we both thought we were referring to, was a very different conception. Because in America, the emphasis is on the individual, and society is a group of individuals. And in India, and true in Asia as a whole, society is an integrated whole of which there are individual members with some latitude of freedom. And once I began to realize it, I saw how much my perspective was structured by my early experience. Only when I went back to America and started sharing ideas with other Americans, and they came up with the same view that I had had, and then I could see how much I had been lost in my own structure. So this is an important point for us to come back to when we're talking about deep learning or the future of education. How much should we be teaching a conceptual framework, and how much should we be teaching the boundaries, premises, values, and limitations so that each individual is free to choose and they know. If you don't know you're within a conceptual framework, there's no way to get out of it. And as Byers argues, there's a tremendous resistance to get out of it because we believe this is true, and if you ask me to get out of it without giving me something else, it's kind of just like leaping off a cliff. There's no security in that. So, very fundamental point. The truth or validity of any statement depends on the conceptual system within which it's viewed, and I guess that applies to this statement too, right? By definition. By the way, this reminded me when we were discussing about Steve Jobs this morning. When Steve Jobs, I don't know if you know the story, but quickly, he was thrown out of Apple in 1985, and then he came back to Apple in 1996 after having failed at Next and made a great success at Pixar. And Disney bought Pixar for, he invested $7 million and sold it for $7 billion. And then Apple invited him back to come back as CEO. And when he was coming back to Apple, after having been thrown out 12 years earlier, Michael Dell, who was then at the peak of his achievements with Dell Computers, Michael Dell was interviewed by some media people, and he said, my advice to Steve Jobs when coming back to Apple is to liquidate the assets and give it to the shareholders. That was at a time, I think, when Apple was $16 billion, and by the time Steve died, Apple was $140 billion and the most valuable company in the history of the world. So this was an experienced entrepreneur, Michael Dell, who was from the industry, who knew everything about the industry, who knew the guy, who knew the company, who knew everything, and he thought he's giving absolute truth. There is no future for Apple. There's no way that Apple can succeed. And then when Jobs went in and launched the first iPhone, it was Steve Ballmer, who was by then the CEO of Microsoft, who said, Apple is really foolish. There's no way that they can get into the smartphone business at this point. There's just no future for them there. So that is the limitation of not knowing that you're in a conceptual system.